The boat glided gently along the narrow canal, the water barely making a ripple as it met the hull. The evening was still, a heavy silence hanging in the air. Around the bend, the shadows of overhanging trees stretched long across the water's surface. The low hum of distant birds faded into the background, and the quiet only deepened. The air was cool, tinged with the earthy scent of damp wood and moss. It was a perfect evening for drifting, the kind where the mind could wander freely. Lena leaned back against the boat's edge, her eyes fluttering closed as the motion of the water lulled her into a state of calm. The rhythm of the boat's glide became a soothing whisper, and the soft sound of her breath began to merge with the water's flow. But then something shifted. A sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, making the leaves rustle and snap in sharp contrast to the tranquility. Lena's eyes snapped open, the sense of unease creeping in like a shadow at the corner of her mind. She couldn't quite place it, an inexplicable tension in the air, a shift in the atmosphere that prickled the back of her neck. The boat slowed, its progress now barely noticeable, as if the water itself had grown still in response to an unseen force. Lena's pulse quickened, a cold chill spreading down her spine. The trees around the canal seemed to lean closer, their branches stretching out as if reaching for her. She could hear the faintest whisper of something, or was it someone? The sound seemed to come from just beyond her line of sight, hidden in the thick brush along the canal. Her heart beat louder now, each thump reverberating in her chest. She gripped the edge of the boat tightly, her fingers cold and tense. The air tasted metallic, like the promise of something wrong. She tried to focus on the gentle sway of the boat, the water still so calm. But the silence was oppressive. A creak, no, a scrape, came from the dark water beneath her. The sound was unmistakable. Something or someone was moving below. Lena's breath caught in her throat as her eyes darted nervously over the water. She could feel a presence just out of sight. She wasn't alone. Her heart raced, each beat echoing louder than the last. The scrape sounded again, this time closer. Lena's eyes darted frantically across the water, but there was nothing. Nothing but the dark reflection of the trees and the stillness. But the air was different now. Heavier, cold. The whispering sound was unmistakable, like faint footsteps slipping through the brush along the canal's edge. Her throat tightened as she strained her ears, trying to pinpoint the source. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't just the rustling of the leaves. It was something else. She leaned forward, squinting into the gloom, the light from the setting sun barely enough to reveal the dark water ahead. The boat gave a small lurch, as though something below was shifting the very water beneath her. Lena's hands tightened around the boat's sides. Her breath quickened. A low murmur reached her ears. No words, just an eerie, unnatural sound. It was coming from directly beneath her. Her body froze, unable to move, as her senses screamed for her to act. There it was again, that scraping noise, followed by a slow, deliberate thud. It was impossible to ignore. Something was rising up from the depths of the canal. She leaned back, eyes wide, heart racing. A shadow moved beneath the water surface, just out of her view. Her skin prickled, the hairs on her neck standing up in a cold, unnerving wave. For a moment, everything was still. The boat was no longer drifting, held in a strange, suffocating stasis. The sound beneath her stopped. Lena's hands trembled as she reached for the paddle, her mind screaming for her to row, to leave, to escape. But the water seemed to hold her in place, as if it were waiting for something. And then, suddenly, the water beneath the boat surged. A violent ripple broke the calm, splashing water up over the sides of the boat. Her breath caught in her throat as something huge and dark broke the surface. She tried to push herself away from the edge, but the boat was already tipping. It was too late. The thing rose higher. Lena's heart skipped a beat as she saw it clearly for the first time. A massive shape, slick and gleaming, rising from the canal like a shadow from the depths. It was a creature like nothing she had ever seen before. Its eyes glinted from within the dark, hollow depths of the water, piercing her with an unnatural, knowing gaze. Her stomach lurched. She couldn't look away, and for the briefest moment, it felt like time had frozen. Everything hung suspended in the eerie quiet. Then, with a sudden, deafening crash, the creature lunged, pulling the boat into the water with terrifying force. Lena gasped, water rushing into her mouth as she was pulled into the cold, dark depths. The last thing she saw was the glowing eyes of the creature, watching her from the deep. The world around Lena blurred as the water closed in over her, cold and unforgiving. Her chest burned as she fought to surface, her arms flailing wildly, but the weight of the water seemed endless, dragging her down, deeper into the black abyss. She gasped for air, but there was only more water, icy, suffocating water. Her heart pounded in her ears, drowning out everything but the overwhelming pressure of the depths. She couldn't tell which way was up or down. Her limbs felt heavy, her body sinking, and for a brief moment, she thought she might lose herself to the dark. But then a sharp tug at her arm. Someone pulled her upwards, breaking through the surface with a force that took her breath away. Lena's face broke through the water, and she coughed violently, sucking in air, feeling the weight of it in her chest. Her eyes snapped open, frantic, searching for any sign of land, any sign of escape. She saw nothing but the endless dark water stretching out before her. The boat was gone. The creature was gone. But the water still held her in its grip. Her skin felt numb from the cold, her fingers stiff with exhaustion, but her legs kicked frantically, propelling her through the current. The shadows around her seemed to move with her, like the trees were closing in once again, their branches swaying in the moonlight. The canal, the trees, the water, it all felt wrong now, twisted into something darker, something she couldn't understand. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she paddled harder, her arms burning, muscles screaming for release. The whispering sound from before, the one that had set her heart racing, was back. A low murmur, faint but growing louder. It surrounded her, filling the air with a haunting, eerie presence. The sensation of being watched was overpowering. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her, creeping just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. She dared not look back. But when a soft splash sounded behind her, she couldn't help herself. Lena twisted her head, her breath catching in her throat as she saw it. A shadow, moving just below the water, following her with chilling precision. Her pulse raced as panic surged once more, her limbs moving frantically, pushing her faster through the canal, but it was no use. The thing was gaining on her. Closer, closer, a sudden, sharp tug at her foot. She screamed, the sound lost to the vast expanse of water, as the cold hands of the depths reached for her once again. She kicked wildly, but her body was dragged under, the water swallowing her whole, pulling her back into the darkness. This time, there would be no escape. The pressure of the water was suffocating. It pressed against her chest, her limbs growing weaker with each passing second. Lena's mind was clouded with panic, her thoughts spinning in a dizzying whirl. The shadows under the water surrounded her, closing in, their movements swift and deliberate. Her heart raced, but her body felt as though it were moving in slow motion, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. The cold seemed to seep into her bones, numbing her senses as though she was being pulled into a place far deeper than the canal itself. She fought with everything she had left. Her legs kicked, her arms lashed out, but the dark hands of the water seemed to grow stronger, relentless in their pull. And then, just as she thought she could not hold on any longer, her hand touched something solid. A sharp, jagged rock, its surface rough and unforgiving. Desperation surged through her, and she reached for it, clinging to it with all her strength, her breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, Lena thought she might have found an escape, a chance to break free. She pushed against the rock, using it as leverage to try and force her way to the surface, but the grip of the water was too powerful, too unyielding. She glanced up, her eyes searching the darkness above, hoping for a sign, any sign, that help was near. The surface of the water seemed impossibly far away, the faint moonlight casting an eerie glow on the ripples above. Her limbs were heavy now, her strength fading, but she fought harder, clawing at the rock, using every ounce of willpower she had left. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. It was no longer just a whisper. It was a voice, low, guttural, and filled with an unnatural sense of menace. It spoke her name. Lena froze, her hand tightening around the rock as her breath caught in her throat. The voice was familiar, yet wrong. A part of her knew she should not listen, that she should not turn toward it, but her body betrayed her. Her eyes darted down, into the dark, murky water below. There, in the depths, she saw it. The creature. It had risen again, its massive form shimmering in the shadows beneath the water's surface. Its glowing eyes locked onto hers, unblinking, like a predator stalking its prey. The whispering voice came again, louder now, almost as if it were right next to her ear. It spoke, not in words, but in a language Lena could not understand. And yet, it was clear. It wanted her. Her breath quickened as her heart thudded painfully in her chest. No, no, she couldn't let it have her. She couldn't. She kicked, harder now, pushing against the rock, her arms flailing wildly. But the creature was too close now. It was rising faster than she could fight. The water churned, the surface bubbling violently as something from below reached up for her. A cold, slick hand wrapped around her ankle, pulling her under. Lena screamed, the sound lost in the water, as the dark depths enveloped her once more. The last thing she saw was the creature's eyes, glowing bright and cruel, watching as the water swallowed her whole. And then there was nothing. The water was thick, suffocating, as Lena's body was dragged deeper into the abyss. Her chest ached as she struggled to breathe, but the pressure of the water kept her trapped in its cold, unyielding grasp. Her arms flailed in the dark, but there was nothing to grab onto, no rock to anchor herself, no hope to cling to. Her mind spun in disorienting circles, each second stretching on in a maddening blur of cold and fear. And then, just as the last of her strength seemed to fade, something shifted. A light, a faint, shimmering glow appeared in the distance. At first, Lena thought it was a trick of her fading vision, a hallucination brought on by the crushing weight of the water. But the light was real. It pulsed softly, a warm golden hue cutting through the darkness. Something inside her stirred, a flicker of hope sparking deep within her chest. She kicked her legs, propelled by an instinctive desire to reach the light, to escape the cold grip of the depths that had taken her so far down. The water was still heavy, pulling at her, but the light beckoned, pulling her toward it with a force that made her body move despite her exhaustion. The light grew brighter, larger as she swam, her body aching with each movement. She could see it clearly now, its source somewhere ahead, a glowing orb of warmth, floating in the murky water. It seemed to move with her, as if it were guiding her, leading her away from the dark. But the shadows weren't far behind. The creature, it was still there, lurking just beyond the reach of the light. Lena could feel its presence, lurking in the water, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, each thump a reminder that she wasn't out of danger yet. With every kick, with every stroke, the light seemed to draw closer. And then, with a sudden surge of energy, her hand broke the surface. Lena gasped, her mouth filling with air as she pulled herself up, her head emerging from the water. The light was above her now, shining brightly against the dark sky. She wasn't sure where the light had come from or why it was here, but it was her only chance. She clung to it, holding on with desperate strength as she felt the pull of the water release. For a moment, there was peace. The terrifying weight that had pressed against her chest was gone, replaced by the warmth of the light that enveloped her. She could hear the soft ripples of the water as it calmed around her. And then, she felt it again, the tug, the pull from below. The creature was still there. It wasn't done with her. But the light, it had changed. It wasn't just a source of warmth now. It was something else. Something powerful. It pulsed again, brighter this time, as though it were alive, as though it were responding to the danger below. Lena's fingers tightened around the glow, feeling the energy radiating from it, lifting her, carrying her away from the darkness. The water surged again, the canal trembling beneath her. But this time it was different. The creature beneath the surface seemed to recoil, its presence withdrawing in the face of the light's intensity. Lena's breath caught in her throat as the light flared once more, blindingly bright. The shadows receded, and the creature faded into nothingness. The light pulsed once more, steady and bright, pushing back the darkness with every beat. Lena clung to it, her fingers wrapped tightly around the glowing orb, feeling its warmth seeping into her bones, filling her with a sense of peace she hadn't known in what felt like forever. The cold weight of the water no longer pressed down on her. The relentless pull from below had ceased. The terrifying shadows beneath the surface had disappeared, leaving only calm, still water around her. She floated there, suspended between the world of darkness and light, unsure of where she was or how she had gotten here. But the fear that had gripped her for what seemed like an eternity was slowly melting away. She took a deep breath, her lungs filling with the cool, fresh air, feeling her body rise to the surface as though the very water was lifting her, cradling her in its embrace. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of her own breath, the soft lapping of the water around her, and the quiet hum of the light that hovered just above her. She glanced around, but the canal she had known, the dark, narrow waterway, was gone. In its place was something completely different. The water was clear, sparkling beneath the warm, golden glow of the light. The trees along the canal had disappeared, replaced by vast open skies stretching endlessly above her. She saw no sign of the creature, no sign of the shadows that had haunted her. The world around her felt safe, untouched by the horrors that had threatened to pull her under. The orb of light drifted closer to her, as if sensing her need for reassurance, its glow casting long, peaceful shadows on the water's surface. Lena's fingers relaxed their grip, and the light seemed to respond, hovering gently in front of her as if waiting for her to make the next move. She wasn't sure where she was, or what this place was, but she felt at ease. For the first time in what felt like ages, she could simply breathe, free of the suffocating weight of fear and uncertainty. Her heart still beat in her chest, but now it was steady, strong. Her limbs felt light, no longer weighed down by exhaustion or cold. The whispering voice was gone. The creature, whatever it was nothing but a distant memory now. She had escaped. She was safe. Lena closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the light wash over her, a soft smile curling at the edges of her lips. In this new, quiet world, there was nothing but peace. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Lena let herself rest. Lena floated in the serene quiet, her mind unburdened by the chaos of what had come before. The weight of her fear had lifted, replaced by a gentle calm that seemed to permeate every inch of her being. The light hovered just above her, steady and unwavering, its golden glow shimmering softly across the clear water. There was no sign of the creature, no hint of darkness lurking just beneath the surface. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Lena could breathe without fear, without the nagging sense that something was waiting to pull her under. The orb pulsed gently, almost like a heartbeat, a rhythm that seemed to sync with her own. She reached out tentatively, her hand just grazing the light. It was warm, but not hot, comforting, as though it were infused with a kind of protective energy. She felt safe. Lena took another deep breath, her gaze lifting to the sky above. The stars had begun to appear, twinkling like distant diamonds against the vast expanse of dark velvet. She wondered where she was. What had happened to the canal? To the trees? To the creature? Had it all been a nightmare? Or had she truly escaped something far darker, far more sinister? The soft ripples in the water were the only movement around her now, and even that felt peaceful, rhythmic. Her body felt weightless, free from the heavy, oppressive pull that had once threatened to drag her down. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the soft hum of the light and the gentle sounds of the water soothe her. But as she began to relax, to let go of the tension that had held her for so long, something shifted in the air. A strange sensation crawled up her spine, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like a soft vibration in the water that rippled through the air. Lena's eyes snapped open, and for the first time in this strange new world, she felt the faintest trace of fear begin to return. The light above her flickered. Just once, but enough to make her heart skip. It flickered again, brighter this time, as if something had disturbed the peaceful aura around her. She frowned, searching the still water, the stars above, the expanse of sky. Everything seemed as calm as it had been moments before. Yet something was different. The quiet had deepened, thickened, like the air was heavy with expectation. And then, without warning, the light pulsed one last time, so bright, so overwhelming, that Lena had to close her eyes against the intensity. When she opened them again, the peaceful world she had come to trust was gone. The water around her had turned dark, no longer clear and calm, but murky and churning. The stars overhead had disappeared, swallowed by a thick fog that now rolled in, obscuring the sky. The warmth of the light had vanished, replaced by a sharp, biting cold that nipped at her skin. Lena's heart began to race once more. The peace she had felt was slipping away. Something was coming. And this time, she wasn't sure if the light could save her. The water around Lena twisted, darkening with every passing second. The fog grew thicker, curling in waves around her, obscuring her vision. Her breath became shallow as she tried to make sense of the sudden shift in the world. The warm golden light, once her sanctuary, flickered again, this time weaker, struggling to hold its place in the overwhelming darkness. Lena's pulse quickened. The water began to churn beneath her, slow at first, then with increasing intensity, as if something was moving below the surface. A cold, unnatural wind picked up, blowing through the thickening fog, carrying with it a sense of impending dread. Her hands trembled as she reached out, seeking the orb, but it was no longer as comforting as it had been. It was small now, its light waning, almost as if it, too, were afraid. A low rumble echoed from deep within the water, a sound that sent a wave of fear crashing over Lena. She scanned the dark, trying to locate the source of the disturbance. The water's surface rippled violently, as if something immense was stirring just beneath the surface. Lena's heart pounded in her chest, each beat thundering in her ears. Then, a flash, something emerged from the water, but it was too fast, too fleeting for her to comprehend. A dark shape, larger than any creature she had seen before, twisted just beneath her. It was the same presence, the same feeling she had felt before, that pull from the depths. Lena's eyes widened as she realized with horror that the creature was not gone. It had never left. Her breath hitched as the shape broke through the surface in a violent rush. But this time, it was not the same creature. No longer a singular entity, it was something else. A mass of writhing shadows, shifting and contorting in unnatural ways. Its eyes, those glowing eyes, were there, but now they were many, spread across the monstrous shape that loomed just beneath her, each one burning with an insatiable hunger. Lena gasped, her mind struggling to grasp the impossible sight before her. The creature had evolved. It had multiplied. The light in her hand flickered again, dimming as the darkness around her grew stronger, more oppressive. She tried to swim, to move away, but the water was like tar now, heavy and thick, pulling her down with each stroke. The shadows beneath the surface grew darker, swirling around her, closing in like a net. Her arms grew tired, her body exhausted from the frantic struggle to escape, but it was no use. The creature's many eyes watched her, unblinking, unfeeling, as it began to emerge from the depths, dragging itself upward with terrifying speed. Lena's mind raced. She had to get away. Her hands reached for the orb of light once more, but it had shrunk to the size of a small flame, barely holding on to its glow. Her heart ached, the hope she had once felt slipping away as the dark shape moved closer. But then, just as the shadow loomed over her, the light pulsed one final time. It flared brightly, painfully so, and for a fleeting moment, Lena thought she could feel its power surge. A blinding light filled the space around her, radiating outward from the small orb, pushing back the darkness. The creature recoiled, its many eyes narrowing in painful response to the brilliance of the light. Lena didn't hesitate. With one final, desperate effort, she reached out and grasped the orb tightly in both hands. The light exploded outward in a brilliant wave, sweeping over the water, over the creature, driving it back into the depths from which it had come. The churning water stilled. The fog began to dissipate. And slowly, as the light began to fade, the darkness receded. Lena's breath came in ragged gasps as the last remnants of the shadowy mass disappeared beneath the surface. The water around her was still again. The orb of light flickered once, then extinguished, leaving only the quiet calm of the canal. For a long moment, Lena floated there, completely still, not daring to move, not daring to breathe. The night was quiet, peaceful even. The moon hung above her, casting its soft light over the still water, as if the terrifying ordeal had never happened at all. Lena closed her eyes, exhaustion weighing heavily on her body, but a new peace settled over her. The darkness was gone. The creature was gone. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she could truly rest. Lena floated in the quiet waters, her body finally giving in to the peaceful stillness that surrounded her. The lingering remnants of fear, the sharp edges of dread that had once consumed her, faded like the last traces of a nightmare. The canal, now calm and unbroken, held no trace of the terror that had once gripped it. It was as though the darkness had been erased, banished from this place forever. The air felt warmer now, and the water, once cold and suffocating, now felt like a gentle embrace, cradling her, supporting her. The moon above shone with an almost surreal clarity, its reflection a soft, shimmering path across the water's surface, leading nowhere in particular, but inviting her to follow nonetheless. For a long time, Lena simply lay there, letting the waves carry her, her eyes closed, her breathing slow and steady. There was no need to rush, no need to escape anymore. She felt safe. She felt free. And yet, even as the calm seemed absolute, a small, nagging thought lingered at the back of her mind. Was it truly over? Had she truly escaped? Or was it just a fleeting calm before the storm? The thought flickered like a distant, fading ember, but she pushed it away. She had made it through. For once, Lena allowed herself to believe in the peace around her. But then, just as she began to relax completely, a faint sound reached her ears. A whisper carried on the water, soft and low, almost too faint to hear. Lena tensed, her heart skipping a beat, her mind alert once again. She held her breath, straining to listen. The whisper came again, louder this time. Her name. It was unmistakable. A soft, haunting echo in the silence. Lena's pulse quickened, her senses sharpening as she slowly turned her head, scanning the water around her. At first, she saw nothing. Only the ripples of the calm water, the reflection of the moon. But then, from the shadows at the edges of the canal, something moved. A shape, subtle and indistinct, barely visible against the dark backdrop of the trees. Her heart hammered in her chest as her eyes fixed on it. The whisper came again, closer now. Lena. She wasn't alone. The shape in the water slowly emerged, gliding silently toward her. Lena's breath caught in her throat as the figure became clearer, a dark silhouette against the fading moonlight. It was a person, or something like a person. A figure with elongated limbs, moving in unnatural jerks, as though it was struggling to remain in one shape. The voice, distorted now, echoed in her mind. "You can't escape." Lena's heart raced, the fragile peace shattered. The light, which had once protected her, felt far away, dimming as the figure drew closer. It was the creature, or something like it. A distorted reflection, a fragment of the nightmare that had not yet released its grip on her. "Lena," it whispered again, the sound growing louder, more insistent, as the figure's shape grew clearer. It was not just one being. It was a collection of shadows, of faces, many faces, distorted and shifting, all locked onto her. She tried to move, to swim away, but her limbs felt heavy, like they were made of lead. The figure's gaze never left her. And this time, Lena knew it was not done with her. Not yet. The water around her began to churn again, the calmness vanishing, replaced by the sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. The darkness, the creature, was never far. Lena's body refused to obey her, heavy and slow, as the figure moved closer. Its presence was suffocating, and with each passing moment, the air around her seemed to grow thicker, heavier, as if the very atmosphere was being absorbed into the creature. The whispers intensified, blending into a chorus of voices, all speaking in unison, calling her name over and over. "Lena." Her chest tightened, panic rising like a tidal wave. She forced herself to kick, to push her arms through the water, but each stroke felt like it was dragging her deeper into the shadows. The figure in the water seemed to shift and blur, its many faces contorting in grotesque, agonized expressions, as if each one were trapped in its own form of torment. The edges of the shadows around it twisted, stretching, reaching for her. "Don't run." The voice whispered again, now chilling and hollow. "Don't hide." Lena's breath caught in her throat, her pulse thudding so loudly in her ears that it drowned out everything else. The water beneath her churned violently, and before she could react, something cold, unnervingly cold, wrapped around her ankle, yanking her downward with terrifying force. She gasped, her body jerking as the water surged beneath her, dragging her into its depths. The figure's glowing eyes locked onto hers, unblinking, unrelenting. "Not again," Lena managed to whisper, but it was no use. The shadows rose up, engulfing her. She felt the cold tendrils of darkness slip around her arms, her legs, coiling tightly, suffocating her with their grip. The light, the warmth, the safety, all of it felt like a distant memory now, lost beneath the weight of the shadows. Her mind screamed, her lungs burning for air as she was pulled under, deeper and deeper, the murky water closing in around her. But just as the darkness threatened to claim her completely, a sudden burst of force, a flash of light, pulsed through the water, breaking the silence with a deafening crack. The creature recoiled, the cold grip loosening as the light surged once more, burning through the suffocating blackness. Lena's body was free, her lungs gasping for air as she broke the surface, the cool night air filling her chest. But the light, so bright, so pure, didn't last. The figure, now fully emerged, stood before her. Its twisted form, hundreds of eyes all watching her, its voice a jagged, discordant symphony. "Why do you fight?" It hissed, its many faces contorting, stretching in ways that made Lena's stomach churn. "You cannot escape." Lena shook her head, her entire being trembling with fear, but also something else. A defiance. Her heart pounded in her chest as she pushed herself to her feet, the water still swirling violently around her, threatening to drag her back into its depths. "I'm not yours," Lena whispered fiercely, her voice trembling with the force of her words. The figure paused, the glowing eyes narrowing, the darkness around it momentarily still. For a brief moment, everything seemed to hang in balance. Then, as if in response to her defiance, the creature's faces twisted further, its jagged mouths opening wide in a silent scream. And the shadows came again. But this time, Lena didn't hesitate. With all the strength she could muster, she reached out, her hand grabbing for the small flicker of light that had never truly gone out. The orb of light pulsed, brighter now, a beacon of warmth and hope in the face of the dark. With a scream, she thrust the light forward, pushing it into the shadowy mass. The light cut through the darkness like a blade, shattering the oppressive silence. The creature howled, its many eyes screaming in agony as the light surged outward, enveloping everything. Lena held on to the light, fighting with every ounce of strength she had left, the force of the brightness overwhelming, driving the shadows back, forcing them into retreat. The water churned violently around her as the creature writhed and twisted, but the light was relentless. And finally, as the creature shrieked its final cry, the shadows dissipated, pulled into the light, until there was nothing left but the calm of the water. The moon rose above her, casting its gentle glow over the now still canal. Lena floated there, exhausted, but victorious. The darkness had been banished. The creature, the nightmare, was gone. For now. And though she didn't know how long this peace would last, Lena allowed herself to rest, the weight of her journey finally lifting from her shoulders. The canal was silent once more. Lena drifted in the stillness, her limbs heavy with exhaustion, but her mind was clearer than it had been in what felt like forever. The water around her, once a place of dread and suffocating fear, now felt like an old, familiar friend. The moonlight bathed the surface, casting soft ripples in its glow, and for the first time, Lena could let herself breathe without the constant threat of something lurking beneath. The weight of the darkness had been lifted, its shadows dissipating into nothingness, leaving only the gentle quiet of the world around her. Lena closed her eyes, letting the peace settle over her. Her heart, once racing with terror, now beat slowly, steadily, in time with the gentle flow of the water. She felt as though she had shed an old skin, something heavy and oppressive, now gone. In its place was lightness, a quiet strength she hadn't realized she possessed. As she lay there, floating effortlessly on the water, the fog began to lift entirely, revealing the full expanse of the sky above. The stars twinkled in the distance, serene and unchanging, a promise that no darkness could last forever. Lena didn't want to move, didn't want to disturb the fragile peace she had earned. The canal was no longer a prison. It was a sanctuary. And yet, a part of her couldn't ignore the deep feeling that lingered. A faint trace of unease, like a memory of a storm long past, lingering in the back of her mind. She tried to dismiss it. The creature was gone. The light had won. But she couldn't shake the thought. Was it truly over? Her eyes wandered, searching the calm water, scanning the now quiet banks. The trees, once twisted and dark, now stood tall and still, bathed in soft moonlight. And then, just as her mind began to settle, she heard it again. A whisper.
Soft.
Almost imperceptible. But it was there. Lena froze, her heart leaping in her chest. She wasn't alone. The whisper came again, clearer now, and this time she could make out the words. You cannot escape. It was a voice, familiar and yet not. The same hollow, chilling tone she had heard before, but with something else, something different. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She scanned the water again, her heart racing. Nothing. The silence returned, as still as before, but the unease was there, thick in the air. Had she imagined it? Had the darkness never really left? Or was it simply biding its time, waiting for her to let her guard down? Lena pushed the thought aside, forcing herself to take a slow, steadying breath. There was nothing. She was safe.
For now.
But the memory of the voice, of the whispers, lingered in her mind, gnawing at her. A part of her knew that the peace she felt now, this stillness, this calm, was fragile. It was only a matter of time before the darkness would rise again. The question was when? But Lena refused to succumb to fear this time. She had fought once, and she had survived. She could do it again. And so, as the moonlight stretched across the water, Lena closed her eyes once more, letting the calm take her. She wasn't sure how long this peace would last, or what would come next, but for now, she would rest. The canal, though haunted by whispers of the past, was no longer a place of terror. It was a place of quiet strength, and she would stand guard, ready for whatever came next. The shadows might return, but she was no longer afraid. The night stretched on, the stars overhead twinkling like distant promises, their light reflecting off the glassy surface of the canal. Lena remained afloat, drifting gently with the current, but her mind, though exhausted, refused to completely surrender to sleep. There was a wariness now, a sharpened edge to her thoughts that hadn't been there before. The whispers, the voice, it lingered like an echo in her ears. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting, lurking just out of sight. The stillness around her seemed too perfect, too unreal, as though the world had paused in a fragile moment, holding its breath. The sound of her breathing was the only noise that filled the air. Deep, measured, as she tried to calm her fraying nerves. The water lapped softly at the sides of the canal. The trees stood still in the moonlight, their long shadows stretching across the ground. But even in this quiet, there was a tension, like the space before a storm, when the air is thick with anticipation, yet nothing stirs. Lena's eyes flicked open once more. The sky was dark now, the fog completely gone, leaving only the vast, endless stretch of stars above.
She was alone, she thought.
Alone in the calm, in the fragile peace that had settled over the water. But just as her heart began to slow, As the tight coil of fear inside her began to loosen, a sound pierced the silence. A soft ripple, subtle at first, then more pronounced, as if something large and heavy was moving beneath the water's surface. Lena's breath caught in her throat. The calm water had suddenly become restless, rippling and churning in the stillness. The shadows in the trees seemed to stretch longer, leaning closer, as though they were reaching for her. Her pulse quickened. The whispers returned, faint at first, then louder, filling her mind with their haunting refrain. "You cannot escape." Lena's body tensed, her heart hammering against her ribcage. The water shifted again, this time more violently. She could feel something beneath her, moving, a presence creeping, pulling at the edges of her senses. The air turned colder, the gentle breeze now sharp, biting at her skin. The shadows beneath the water seemed to deepen, dark shapes swirling just below the surface, moving toward her. Lena's mind raced, trying to make sense of the sight. Something was there. Something was stirring just beneath her. The darkness, the creature, had never truly left. It was waiting. She could feel it. Her heart pounded in her chest, the terror rising again, but this time there was no panic. Lena knew what she had to do. With a deep breath, she focused on the light that still burned within her, the faint memory of its warmth, its protection. She reached for it, calling on it with everything she had. But the water pulled at her, sucking her deeper into its depths, as if trying to drag her down into its dark embrace. The shadows below rose faster now, faster than she could reach the light. And then, from the darkness, a figure emerged, a shape shifting, contorting, like a mirage forming out of the very shadows themselves. Its eyes, glowing a deep and unnatural green, locked onto hers. Lena froze. The creature was back. But this time, it was not as she remembered. It had changed. Evolved, perhaps. Its form was a mass of writhing tendrils, eyes flickering in the dark, and as it emerged from the water, its many faces distorted into expressions of hunger. Lena's blood ran cold. It was worse than before. Much worse. The creature's voice filled her mind, cold and venomous. "You thought you were safe." Lena's hands trembled, but she didn't retreat. The creature's form twisted again, and just as she thought she would be engulfed by the shadows, the orb of light inside her flared once more, brighter than before. The light surged out, cutting through the oppressive dark, surrounding her with a warm, blinding glow. The creature recoiled. Its many eyes narrowed, its form shifting and thrashing violently in response to the light. But Lena didn't stop. With every ounce of strength, she pushed the light forward, forcing it into the creature's writhing mass. It screamed, a terrible, unearthly sound. But Lena held firm, the light growing brighter, more powerful, until the creature was forced back into the water, retreating, thrashing, fighting against the light. And then, with one final, ear-splitting scream, it dissolved into the depths. The water stilled again. The air became still. The whispers faded. Lena's body sagged in exhaustion, her mind reeling from the encounter. But the light had won. For now. And though she didn't know what the future held, she knew one thing with certainty. She would not let the darkness consume her. Not again. The canal was quiet once more. Lena floated in the stillness, her body limp with fatigue, but her mind wide awake, every sense alert. The eerie quiet that followed the creature's retreat felt almost unnatural, too peaceful, as though the canal itself were holding its breath. The ripples on the water had stilled, and the air felt warmer now, more breathable. The moonlight shone softer, its glow gentle on the surface of the water, as though the very sky itself was watching over her. But even in this peace, Lena knew better than to relax completely. The darkness had come for her once, and it would come again. The thoughts haunted her, as they always did. That whisper, the feeling of being watched, the terror that still gripped her even in moments of calm. It was as though the shadows never truly released their hold. She glanced around the canal, her eyes scanning every inch, but there was nothing to see, no movement, no presence. Just the gentle sway of the trees, the faint reflection of the stars in the water. But her heart still raced. "You're not safe," the voice had said before. The thought lingered in her mind now, gnawing at her. The light had won, yes. But what if it was temporary? What if, deep beneath the surface, the creature was simply waiting for the right moment to strike again? Lena shook her head, trying to push the thought aside. She had fought it off before, and she could do it again. The light inside her was still there, still strong. But something nagged at her, an unsettling truth she couldn't ignore. She hadn't seen the creature disappear entirely. The water, where it had sunk, still rippled in strange patterns, as though something unseen was shifting beneath. Lena took in a slow, deliberate breath, her hands gripping the edge of the boat she still clung to. She forced herself to sit up, the cold from the water now seeping into her skin. She had to move, to leave this place before the feeling of dread became too much to bear. But before she could push herself any further, there was a soft sound from behind her. A splash. Lena's heart stopped. It wasn't the wind or the ripples of the water. No, this was something real. Something moving beneath the surface. Her eyes darted to the dark stretch of water behind her, where the moonlight couldn't quite reach, where shadows clung tightly to the edges of the canal. She tried to ignore the knot tightening in her stomach, the way her pulse began to race once more. The splash came again, louder now. Closer. Lena's breath came in short, sharp bursts, and her gaze locked onto the dark spot in the water, her body rigid, ready to bolt. And then, through the darkness, something emerged. A single, elongated hand. Pale, with fingers too long, almost skeletal. It gripped the side of the boat with unnatural strength, pulling itself slowly out of the water. Lena froze. It wasn't the creature. No, this was different. It was someone else. A figure, human in shape, but something in its presence felt wrong, corrupted. Its eyes, empty, black pits, stared at her with an eerie, lifeless gaze. The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky, unnervingly deliberate, as though it was learning to walk again, but in an unnatural way. Lena's heart thundered in her chest. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, her body gripped by an instinctual terror. Lena, the figure whispered, its voice a hollow, distorted echo. Her name. Lena's mind raced, her body frozen in place. It was a whisper from the depths, an echo from something lost. The figure stepped closer, and as it did, the air around her seemed to thicken, the world slowing down. She could feel the weight of it, like a storm on the horizon, yet she was helpless to move against it. Lena's mouth went dry. She couldn't breathe. The figure's gaze was unblinking, its fingers reaching out toward her, and with each passing moment, Lena could feel the coldness of it growing, creeping into her bones. It was only a matter of time before she was consumed. No. Lena's hand shot out toward the light, the small orb of warmth she'd called into existence before. She could feel its pulse inside her, its strength. She had to use it. She had to fight back, or it would take her just like it had taken so many others. The figure's smile spread slowly across its face, a grotesque, twisted thing, but the moment it did, Lena's light erupted with brilliant force, casting a brilliant beam that cut through the fog of the canal and shattered the figure's form into fragments. The shadow dissipated, but the air didn't return to calm. Lena gripped the sides of the boat tightly, breathless, heart pounding, eyes darting across the water. The shadows were still there. They had not left. And the whispers, they continued. The whispers filled her mind again, louder now, as though the very air around her was breathing them into existence. They were everywhere, circling, pressing against her thoughts, insistent and cold. You can't escape. You can't run. You can't hide. Lena's chest tightened, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the eerie sensation of being watched returned. She felt it in her bones, the suffocating certainty that something was moving, stalking just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Her eyes darted across the canal once more, desperately searching for any sign, any movement that would give her a clue of what was happening. The water, once calm, now shifted again, a subtle disturbance beneath the surface. The ripples spread outward, undulating in unnatural patterns, as though something far below was stirring, its movement slow but deliberate. Lena gripped the edge of the boat tighter, her knuckles white with tension. She wanted to scream, to shout, to do something, anything, but her throat felt tight, as though the words themselves had been stolen from her. The figure, the one that had reached for her with those skeletal fingers, it had disappeared into the water, but Lena knew that wasn't the end. She could feel it in the way the atmosphere had shifted. The air was thick with anticipation, and the shadows, the darkness, it hadn't retreated. It was simply waiting for the right moment to return. A chill ran down her spine as the water began to churn again, more violently this time. The boat rocked, creaking under the pressure of the unseen force beneath. Something was coming. She could feel it, could hear it now, even over the whispers. A distant splash echoed across the canal, followed by another, closer this time. A low, rhythmic sound, like something large and heavy moving through the water. And then, there it was, the unmistakable feeling of someone, rising from the depths. Lena's heart skipped a beat. A figure emerged slowly from the canal, not human this time, not even close. It was taller than the last, its shape almost formless, a shifting mass of blackness that seemed to suck the light from the world around it. Tentacles, long and twisting, reached out from its core, their tips glowing faintly with an eerie, sickly light. The figure was all eyes, hundreds of them, each one an open, staring abyss, gleaming with a predatory hunger. Each eye looked at her with an intense, unblinking gaze, as though they were searching, studying her, looking for any weakness. Lena's blood ran cold. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. Lena, Lena, you cannot escape. She tried to move, tried to paddle away, but the boat was caught. Something beneath was holding it in place, pulling it toward the creature. The shadowed mass slithered closer, its eyes narrowing, its body shifting, morphing as it advanced. The darkness felt suffocating, pressing in on her from all sides. She had no choice now. No escape. The light inside her was the only weapon she had left. Her heart hammered in her chest as she reached for it, pulling on every thread of strength left inside her. The light flickered, weak at first, but then it surged, burning brighter, pushing back against the shadows, the cold, the creature. It was like a beacon in the dark, a final act of defiance. The figure howled, its form writhing, its eyes squinting as if it were in pain. The shadows around it shrank away, pulled back by the intensity of the light. But the creature wasn't finished. It recoiled for a moment, but it was only regrouping, growing angrier, more determined. Lena's hand trembled as she held the light steady, keeping it aimed at the creature, but the force of its will seemed to push back against her. She could feel the power of the darkness tugging at the edges of her strength. And then the whispers changed, their tone shifting from haunting to mocking. Do you think this light can save you? Do you really believe you are stronger than me? Lena's eyes widened in horror as she realized what was happening and the light, though powerful, was slowly dimming. The creature was draining it, feeding off its energy. Slowly but surely, her strength was being siphoned away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her heart raced in panic. No, she couldn't let it end like this. She couldn't be consumed by this thing. In one desperate motion, Lena willed herself to stand, her body shaking as she faced the creature head-on. She wasn't going to let it win. Not like this. With a fierce determination, she pushed the light outward with every ounce of energy she had left, forcing it to grow, forcing it to burn with all its might. And then, for a split second, it flared, a brilliant beam that illuminated the whole canal, brighter than it had ever been. The creature recoiled, its body writhing in agony as the light seared through the darkness, burning it back, pushing it into retreat. But Lena knew it wasn't over. The creature was retreating for now, but it would return. It always returned. The water began to calm once more, the ripples fading as the figure vanished beneath the surface, leaving only the faintest trace of its presence behind. The whispers fell silent. Lena collapsed to her knees in the boat, exhausted beyond measure, her breath ragged as she fought to remain conscious. She had survived again. For now. But she knew, deep down, that the battle was far from over. The creature was not gone. It was merely waiting, biding its time. And Lena would be ready. Lena awoke in the stillness, her body aching from the constant strain, her mind racing with questions. The canal had returned to its eerie calm, the once turbulent waters now placid, reflecting the bright moon overhead. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe it was over, that the darkness had retreated for good. But deep down, something gnawed at her, a feeling she couldn't ignore. The whispers had stopped, yes, but the silence was thick with the promise of something to come. She could still feel the weight of the shadows lurking just beyond the edges of her perception. The light inside her flickered weakly, as if it too knew the fight was far from over. Lena closed her eyes, drawing in a slow, steadying breath. She needed to rest, to regain her strength. She couldn't fight this constant war forever, but the fear of what might come next kept her on edge. She looked around at the moonlit water once more, the quiet solitude of the night settling over her like a blanket. For now, it was peaceful. The fog had lifted entirely, and the trees on the banks of the canal stood silent and unmoving, their dark outlines sharp against the starry sky. Yet, in the back of her mind, the ever-present feeling of being watched refused to go away. Something shifted in the water. A ripple, too subtle at first, but growing, spreading outward in expanding circles. Lena's breath caught in her throat. There it was again. That unmistakable presence. Her heart raced as she stared at the water, her body tensing, bracing for the inevitable. Slowly, a shape emerged, but this time it was different. It was no longer the dark, monstrous form that had once haunted her every waking moment. Instead, it was something far more familiar, something that sent a chill down her spine. It was a face. Not monstrous, not grotesque, but undeniably chilling. A face she recognized. Lena's eyes widened in horror as the figure floated closer to her, its expression cold, its eyes dark and empty. And then, in a voice that wasn't quite hers, but sounded strangely familiar, the figure whispered, "Did you think you could escape me forever?" And with that, Lena realized the truth. The creature, the darkness, had never been her true enemy. It was the canal itself, the cursed place, the very source of her torment. It would never let her go. The battle wasn't over. It had just begun. Lena's heart pounded as she stared at the face in the water, the chilling recognition crawling beneath her skin. The figure, its empty, hollow eyes, was not something she had expected. It was human, or at least it had once been. Its face mirrored her own, twisted by time, distorted by shadows. It smiled, the curve of its lips sickening in its familiarity, as it floated effortlessly towards her. "Did you really think you could outrun this? That the light would save you?" It whispered, the voice a perfect echo of her deepest fears. The light within Lena flickered again, weaker this time, as though the darkness was leeching away her will, her strength, feeding off the very hope she had clung to for so long. She had been so sure, so certain, that she could escape the nightmare, that she could survive. But now, the truth had emerged in the most terrifying of forms. This wasn't just the creature. This wasn't even the canal. This was her. A reflection of herself twisted into something she could barely recognize. It was the darkness within her, the part that had always lurked just beneath the surface, feeding off her fears, her doubts, her loneliness. She had been running from it for so long, thinking it was something external, something out there. But the creature, the shadows, the whispers, they had always been inside her. Lena felt a sudden, painful clarity, as if the weight of the truth had dropped onto her like a stone. The battle had never been about fighting the darkness outside. It had always been about conquering the darkness within. The figure's face twisted into a mocking grin. You can never outrun yourself. With a final, desperate surge, Lena reached deep into herself, gathering the last of her strength. She grasped the light, not as something to fend off the shadows, but as something to embrace, something to illuminate the darkness within her. The light flared bright, so bright that it almost hurt to look at. The figure in the water screamed, its form dissolving, collapsing under the intensity of the light. The darkness shuddered, pulled back into the depths. And then there was nothing. The canal was still once more. The water shimmered peacefully under the moonlight, reflecting the stars as it had before. Lena's breath came in slow, deep bursts, her body trembling with exhaustion, but her mind, her heart, felt lighter. The journey had been long, the fight had been brutal, but she had won. She had faced herself and emerged stronger, unbroken. The canal, the darkness, the creature, they were no longer her enemy. She was free. The whispers were gone, and for the first time in a long time, the only sound was the soft lapping of water against the boat as Lena drifted on into the quiet, into peace.